Now we're recording. So first thing I wanted to do with you guys today was to share this screen with you that shows, a couple people asked me over the weekend what's left for the last 2 weeks. And so this is what's left. So today I plan on going over chapter 22, tomorrow 23 and 24. 24 is relatively short. Wednesday, quiz 7, which will be chapters 22, 23, 24. Those have already been in the module for you guys to read and to watch the Darwin's Dangerous Idea and the thing about Wallace. I'll be adding mastering work for 22, 23, 24. I will probably make them all due on Friday, the 10th, to give you an extra day. If I were you, of course, I'd try to do them along as today, tomorrow, and before you take the quiz on Wednesday, because it will help you with the quiz. But if you can't get it all done, I understand. There's going to be at least one skills assignment, which, this is an experiment and sort of an evolutionary experiment, and how does it turn out? Answer the questions. And if you want to save that one till Friday, of course, that's fine. Monday's today, the 6th, then we have Tuesday, Wednesday, and Wednesday, even though we do have a quiz, I will be doing a Zoom for chapter 25. Come if you can, come if you want to. I will record it as regular and post it as soon as I can. Thursday, we will do chapter 27, which is, I didn't write that out, should say prokaryotes, so bacteria on Thursday. Friday, as I mentioned, all your mastering and the skills will be due. And then next week, on Monday, I'd like to do protists, which is a very long chapter. I'll try to post some sort of an outline for you to kind of help you focus on the important parts and just what to focus on for that chapter. It might also be not only an outline, but I may post a sort of just a list of these are the things that you should be able, the kinds of questions you should be able to answer for 28. Again, just because it's very lengthy. There'll be mastering homework for 27 and 28 that'll have to be due on Tuesday. I don't plan to have a Zoom meeting on Tuesday or Wednesday. Wednesday of next week will be our final quiz, or you want to call it the final exam, and that will include chapters 25, left over from the end of this week, and 27 and 28. And then we will call it a semester. I don't have the schedule in front of me of when my grades are due, but I will probably plan on entering them by Friday of that week. So if you have any lingering quizzes that you haven't taken, that you need to schedule an oral makeup with me, you've got a week and a half, basically, or 2 weeks, right, to get that done. If not, those will be entered as zeros. Any old assignments that are hanging out there, send me an email, and I will try very hard to, most of them I leave available till the end of the semester, so you can go in anytime in mastering. You'll get point deduction for being late, but the assignment is still sitting there. I think they're all open like till July 24th or something. I think I left them all open too. So that shouldn't be a problem, but let me know if there is a specific problem, especially on the early assignments. I don't know that I was doing that from day one. And then that's it. That's what I have scheduled for the rest of the semester. Questions about this before we move on to chapter 22, because I'd rather just get going with chapter 22, really important chapter. And I want to help you organize it a little bit, because I know that film was very long, but it had a lot of key important items in it. So
I just have a quick question, Dr. Stewart.
Sure. What's up?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to ask, so for the last quiz that we had regarding the genetics, the one that you just graded, the genetics problems.
Yes.
Was that factored into the quiz section, or was that in a different section? Because it didn't change my grade at all. So I was just wondering.
I think if you're in HOL 1, it was in the wrong place. I thought I moved it, but I will double check. It should be in the quizzes. And if it isn't, I'll put it in there. It may just have gotten an assignment designation by accident. So I will, I'll check on that. I was focused on just getting it graded.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought I moved it, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
It also didn't move my grade neither.
So it didn't move it to your
Anything.
lecture scores?
It
I don't
didn't
know.
move nothing at all. The final grade didn't move.
I don't know. I'll try to figure that out. I noticed that on my end, it's not showing up. Like I don't see your scores, even though I entered them. So I just have a little picture of like a submission box. So I'll check on that.
On my end, it says that the instructor is still working on your scores.
I think that means I have to enter zeros for everyone else, right? So I was kind of giving people, there's 2 people hanging out there that haven't turned that in yet. And I was kind of waiting to see if I was going to get something from them over the weekend. And quite honestly, I didn't check today. I was working on the lecture for this morning. So I will, I'll go back to that. And like I said, I'll just have to enter zeros for everyone who didn't turn anything in yet and see if that allows it to be completed. And then I will check to make sure it's in the right category. Category check. Yeah, I tried to, most of you probably noticed if you went in and looked at your scores, at your actual scores, I tried to write on them where you went wrong, and I tried to add comments in the comment section. If any of those don't make sense to you, ask me after class today so that we can talk about that. For the most part, you guys did fine. Yes, I'm working on the library assignment. I'm trying to create a rubric so I don't have to write on everyone's paper, because writing on everyone's paper using my right hand on a mouse is very tedious and time consuming. And a lot of you didn't submit it as just a Word document or PDF, so then I can't write on it and I have to download it to my computer, and it's rather lengthy with all of the links for your papers. So that one's presenting a grading difficulty. I have a webinar with one of the people from our technical support to help me to see if I can find a way to grade that a little bit more easily. And I'm trying to use a rubric for the first time. So that's part of the holdup with that. I've been putting that off on purpose because it's really difficult to grade. Some of you did a great job. Others of you, it's a hot mess. I'm discouraged to have to write all over it. So I was kind of trying to get that done. I think I have a meeting with Ginny today. Today's Monday, right? I think it's today at 2 o'clock. So if I can get that rubric situated, then the rubric will kind of indicate where you've made your mistakes and I won't have to type on everybody's paper. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for that. And that's lab points anyway. So I know you guys all want it to be lecture points to help your grade, your lecture grade, your exam scores, but they're lab points. So, and most of you have really high lab grades anyway. So not to minimize that it isn't important, but it's not going to move your grade very much unless you have a terrible lab score. All right then. I would like to then go on to talking about, where did I put that? I can find my PowerPoints for, yeah. Big. Let's go back to my Zoom meeting and see if I can share. Go out of here and try to share again. There. Okay, can you guys see that? Yes, because the last time we had a little difficulty with everyone not seeing it, right? You guys see it? Everyone can see it? Yes, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so chapter 22 starts a whole new section for us. It's the evolution section, and this is the background for Darwin, what we would call the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution, evolution by natural selection. So I'd like to start with a little bit of history because I'm hoping that you all watched the video, but if you didn't, that's okay. Please try to watch it before too much longer. This is probably one of the most important slides of the chapter because it does show sort of most of the historical background. A lot of times I think students today think that Darwin just came up with this idea all by himself. And I like to tell a little bit of the history and the story behind it because Darwin, like every other scientist ever, we say we stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of all of the work that has come before us. Some things that are new or big ideas that get attached to a particular person, it's because that person often synthesizes a lot of the ideas that were around before they sort of put them all together. And I would remind you, similarly, when we were talking in chapter 16 about the discovery of the structure of DNA, we had a similar thing going on, right? Watson and Crick and Wilkins and Franklin collected a lot of data, but they also collected a lot of historical information from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and put that all together to be able to tell us the structure of DNA. And it's no different for Darwin. So I would start actually, I think on your note outline, which needs a little modification, but, and I'll send you a new one after I type today. And that note outline, I think it starts with Aristotle. And I put that on there on purpose because I want you to, again, think back all the way. Aristotle lived between 384 and 322 BC. And he was basically the first guy that said, hey, I think there are species, I think there are groups of plants and animals, and I think they all are on what he called the scale of nature, which was like a ladder. And he said everything, every species is fixed on this ladder. But the part that your book omitted is that Aristotle actually believed that each species had a will and was striving to climb up to the next step of the ladder. So Aristotle's scale of nature is kind of a mixed bag. It's a hey, everything was created uniquely, perfectly for its environment, but things can change or move from one scale of the ladder, one step of the ladder to the next. So I just give that sort of as a brief idea that people were thinking as early as 380 BC, maybe organisms can change over time. Now, Aristotle's scale of nature gave the basis for Linnaeus to come up with his classification scheme. And I don't think we have that on this particular timeline, but it was early in this, I think it was like 1780s, early 1700s. And we've already mentioned Linnaeus a couple of times. Remember, he's the Swedish botanist, and he is the guy that gave us the binomial nomenclature of genus and species. And he's the guy that started to group, especially plants, into groups where they shared characteristics. Now, some other historical background that's important, these guys here. I'm going to mention Hutton, Lamarck, Malthus, and I would even throw in Darwin's grandfather, which, if you've watched the film, you know the historical reference there. So Hutton is important because he is what we would consider the father of geology. Notice he's publishing his work in 1795. And Hutton's principle of gradualism basically says that the shape of the earth, the surface of the earth, the conditions of the earth are being changed by the environment, particularly water, rain, wind, temperature. And he wrote a lot about how rivers and streams can carve out canyons, bodies of water. And Hutton said he thought that the surface of the earth has gradually changed over time because when he looked at deeper layers of sediment or deeper layers of rock. They were made of a different consistency, indicating that perhaps there was a river here where there isn't one now, or there was a volcano there where there isn't one now. This was big idea, 1795. Malthus always gets a mention in 1798 for a couple of reasons. He would have been an essay, that essay would have been something Darwin would have had to read like when he went to college, right? And the basic principle is Malthus was writing about the human population, and he was saying that the reasons that human population, he thought, was stabilized or didn't get any larger very quickly had to do with the conditions that humans lived in. Famine, war, disease. So is there enough food? Are we at war with another faction? And what diseases, like think about the plague, what's ravaging the population at any given time? And he saw those all as checks on the size of the population. Notice Lamarck publishes his hypothesis of evolution in 1809. It's the same year that Darwin is born, which is kind of ironic. Lamarck is French, and most of you probably have heard of Lamarck's ideas of evolution. His hypothesis was that of acquired characteristics, and it had two components. The characteristics were acquired by the organism based on how the organism lived, and then those characteristics were passed on to the organism's offspring. And the second part of his theory is called use and disuse. Lamarck said the reason that some structures disappear from the fossil record or disappear from an organ system or get much smaller is because they're not being used by the organism for particular function. And famously, his example was giraffes. And he said the reason giraffes have long necks is because they stretch. First, they eat all the leaves at the bottom of the tree, and then they stretch their necks, and so their babies are born with longer necks. Okay? Now, of course, we would think that's kind of the right idea, but the mechanism isn't quite right. And can you guys mute your microphones? Thanks. Very closely here, 1812, Cuvier, and he's important because he's also French, and he and Lamarck are rivals. And Cuvier is actually in charge of the Natural History Museum in Paris, and he is a vertebrate anatomist. So similar to, if you watch the film, similar to Owen, right, who was constructing vertebrate fossil models and then putting them in the Natural History Museum in England. Cuvier had been doing this with vertebrate fossils in France, and Cuvier was a believer in what is called catastrophism. He said the only reason, he was very anti-evolution, very anti-organisms can change over time, and he said the only reason some things have gone extinct is because of catastrophe. And he meant like a natural disaster, a flood, a fire, a volcano, an earthquake. Those are the only things that could change which organisms were alive and which ones were extinct, even though he studied geology, right, or fossils. Okay, now, right around here, we see Lyell publishing his Principles of Geology. This is a huge extension from Hutton, and it's 2 volumes. Notice the first one's published in 1830, right before Darwin leaves on his Voyage of the Beagle. And I was gonna put this up here real quick for a couple of reasons. I usually put the cameo of Darwin because I like you to see him as a young person, right? I like you to see him close to your age, right? So, and this is actually after he got back. I want you to try to imagine getting on, okay, so first of all, he is, yes, he has moderate means. His father is a physician / country doctor in the early 1800s. He has an older brother who you met in the film, who's gone off to medical school at Edinburgh, and Darwin follows in his footsteps. So he gets there and he finds that he doesn't like medicine. He doesn't really have the stomach for dissection and gross anatomy, and he doesn't really want to treat people and their ailments. He's much more interested in smaller animals and plants. He kind of finds a mentor in a botanist, and he first, after he was decided he didn't want to be a doctor like his brother and his father. He was trying to cast about for another major, much like many of you have done, right? And he becomes the sort of pupil of this guy who's a botanist, and he's like, well, what can I do? How can I make my mark in science? You know, there's not many plants in England. You're already kind of the expert here. And his advisor basically says, you know, what would be great is if you would take a voyage and you go someplace where there aren't a lot of descriptions yet in English of various plants and animal species. And then you would have something to study. You could collect specimens. You have something to study for most of your academic career, and you would also have things to write about. So Darwin's like, great, but I don't know anyone. And this guy said, well, I know a guy who's who's in charge of a naval ship, and they need a naturalist, and I can probably write you a letter. That's how Darwin gets on the Beagle. Okay. So here's Darwin again, and again, this is after he comes back, and what I want you to remember, the trip takes 5 years. So imagine being like maybe 18, 20, and then being gone for 5 years of your life, right? Also being seasick the whole time, except when you're on land. This is a picture of the boat, and I like to include that because I think it's easy for us to forget about sailing ships and sailing vessels in the mid-1800s, right? So I want you to look at the size of the men on the boat, right? And this is the whole boat. So it's a pretty tiny ship, and they're going to leave, and the outward bound voyage here has the arrows away from Great Britain, away from London, and you can see that their destination is South America. And mostly what they're supposed to be doing is collecting data on the coastline of South America, because of course Great Britain was in its peak colonial times, and it was thinking, well, we've colonized some of Africa, and we've colonized over here India, maybe we could do some of South America. So it was a naval voyage, right, from the military. The advantage for Darwin is, even though he was seasick this whole time, once they landed in South America, sometimes in the shorter trips here, he would be able to travel over land and meet up with the crew at the next port of call, which saved him a lot of seasickness. All along here, he's collecting specimens. They go around the Cape Horn and up along here Andes Mountains, and then out to the Galapagos Islands, for which he is most famous. Here's a little inset of the Galapagos Islands. Remember, most of these are, if not all of them, are uninhabited islands. Then tip of New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, other side of Australia, a little bit up into Malaysia. Out here, not to Madagascar, but the islands off Madagascar, touch of Africa just to pick up supplies, back to South America, and then home. 5 years. When he gets back to South America, his brother has sent him the second volume of Lyell's Principles of Geology so that he can read it basically the whole way home, because this is going to take weeks. All right, so gone for 5 years, comes back, and this little sketch was in one of his notebooks that he carried around with him when he first started to think about evolution or species changing from one form into another, not being on a ladder, but being more like a tree, right? So if you go to London and you go to the British Museum of Natural History, you can actually see this notebook. It's under a glass case, you can't touch it, but you can at least look at it. It's very exciting. So here's a picture of some of the finches that he studied, right? The cactus eater, the insect eater. These are the big 3 major groups, and there are subgroups of each of these. And again, like you've already heard, there are different versions appear on different islands, and I think there's 13 islands altogether, and they did visit all 13 of them. Why did I include this? Oh, this is for a little bit later, I think. Yes. Okay, so back to, let's just take a glimpse back here. So Darwin finishes his travels in 1836. He comes back, he writes a short, sort of like people do travel blogs. In the 1800s, people did travel books, and he wrote down all his notes, and he told about, you know, what color the ocean was here and how big the mountains were there. And interestingly, in The Voyage of the Beagle, if you ever take the time to read it or have any inclination to read it, he describes a lot of the different islands that they visited, and he actually writes quite a bit on the geology of coral atolls. And it turns out that he did some great observations that also turned out to be sort of scientifically true. His first essay that he writes, 1844, he gets a lot of pushback on that essay, and so he kind of clams up about evolution, and he says, I need more data. I need to collect more data than I have from my voyages. And he started doing research at home, and he also started doing a lot of letter writing and collecting data from other people in other countries. You might recognize Wallace here from, if you watch the short video of Wallace about Alfred Russel Wallace. He also traveled to Malaysia, different island archipelago, and notice it's a little bit later, 1848, and he sees what he considers different species that have evolved due to different environments, probably over time, and he writes an essay about this, and he sends it to Darwin, and it's very similar to what Darwin has already hammered out in Origin of Species. And it is sort of the major push that gets Darwin to publish, because basically he spent almost 20 years, from 1836 to 1859. He spent all that time collecting data and thinking about it, but not actually writing his book, right? So Origin of Species is published in 1859. And I don't know why 1870 is on here. I don't know, it might be when he passes away, I'm not sure. So what's in this big book, right? So I listed out for you on the note handout, sort of Darwin's 5 major points, and I'm just going to run through them kind of quickly and add a few things to each of them. So I wrote down as the first premise of Darwin's Origin of Species, like begets like. And the reason for that is twofold. I want you to realize that the writing in this book is from the 1850s, and so people talked like that and they wrote like that. What he means by that is that he's not going to entertain in this essay or this book that he's writing, he's not going to entertain wild matings between very diverse species. He says, I'm going to concentrate here on organisms that could occur in nature. For example, dogs breed with dogs and produce puppies. Cats breed with cats and make kittens. He's not talking about the liger, right? The lion crossed with the tiger to make this weird, unique organism. That's what he means by like begets like. He's like, I'm studying nature here, what happens in the natural world. And then he brings up among organisms, especially among organisms that produce a lot of offspring, 2 important factors. You see variety among the offspring. Some are larger, some are smaller, some of the spots are different colors. And in general, nature produces more offspring than survive. And this was true in his own life and in human life, especially at this time. No antibiotics. Many times, I think he and his wife Emma had 13 children. Only a handful survived to adulthood because of disease and medical conditions that people, didn't have the answers to or didn't have any cures for. I would remind you that the variation among the offspring comes from different genes, different alleles, like we spoke about with Mendel. Now, Mendel doesn't publish his work until like 1857, and Darwin didn't read it. Remember, Mendel wrote in German, and he wrote very mathematical papers that were kind of remained relatively unknown for about 40 years or so. Now, second, okay, so that's the third. Like begets like, more variation among the offspring, which now we can attribute to Mendel and molecular biology. More offspring produced than survive, right? So there's going to be competition among the offspring. Fourth point is the variations that give a reproductive advantage in particular, in a particular environment, tend to be the offspring of that first generation that are going to produce more offspring in the next generation. So Darwin's writing about how variation gives you a selective advantage in a particular environment at a particular time to leave more offspring, and the accumulation of those advantages, he would call them, or accumulation of those particular alleles that were beneficial in a particular environment. That is what is going to be the driving force of change, of selection, and then thus of evolution or new species coming into existence. And then the last point of his book is that he stresses this accumulation of favorable variations takes a long time, right? And he's going to support that with the fossil record. He means long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, in order to form new species. Now, today, I think in the notes that I gave you, I wrote down evidence to support Darwin's idea, or evidence to support evolution. And I think that I have 5 things listed there. And the most recent version of your textbook limits that to 4. So I'm just going to talk about those 4. So the first main line of evidence for Darwin, or just I'm going to say for the theory of evolution, is direct observation. And I didn't include a PowerPoint picture for this, but your book gives a couple of examples, one with insects and one with bacteria. They give an example of, I'm trying to see, the soap, I think it's called the soapberry bug, right? With its beak size in order to puncture fruit so that it can eat them. And what happens when a new non-native species is introduced, how that puts selective pressure on the native species to increase their beak length. Things that reproduce very quickly, you'll see things like insects, fish, bacteria. Those are often the subject of evolutionary studies in the next 3 or 4 chapters because they have a short lifespan, they leave a lot of offspring, and in one human lifespan, you can see several generations. So one support for Darwin's, sort of the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution, would be direct observation of evolutionary change that we can witness as human beings. We used to call that microevolution. And I think I put a section about microevolution actually in the beginning of the notes for chapter 23. You saw this in the film, the gentleman talking about the hummingbirds. Remember, they were looking at the hummingbird beak length and wing length in the lowlands compared to the highlands of the mountains and the rainforest, right? So that would be a direct example. Oh, and think about Clarence and his virus, his HIV virus, how without medication, right, when he took him off all the drugs, the virus reverted back to wild type, which was then more drug resistant. That's what we mean by microevolution. And in the case of a bacteria and a virus, this can take weeks. All right, another major support for evolution would be homology. And I've included here, oh wait, I want to put this picture up. This would be artificial selection, which you could use as direct observation, as another example of direct observation of evolution. Here's a wild mustard plant. And the purpose of showing this to you is that this is the parent plant for all of these, what we would call vegetables that we eat. Basically, with humans having chosen plants that have larger leaves, apical axillary buds here, big apical tips, side buds, flowers, and stems, and the stems themselves / the roots. Kohlrabi. This part usually is mostly underground. So artificial selection would be another example of direct observation. Second major evidence for evolution is what we would call homology. In this case, this is an example of anatomical homology or bone homology. We have, what helps me remember this always, if you remember it like a little rhyme, the arm of a human, the leg of a cat, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat.
Hello.
Yes, hello? Can you guys not see?
On Friday.
Who's chatting with me? No? All right, a new participant, maybe somebody that I missed. No, okay.
I don't think Victor is muted.
Oh, got it. I just muted him then. There. All right. So back to this diagram of homology. So the point of this is all the same bones are present. They are modified in the different organisms for different functions, right? Because you can actually count the bones. The bone number is exactly the same, and they're highlighted in different colors so that you can see the bones that are the same, right? Clearly, we can't use our arms. We can use them to swim, but we're not going to swim as well as a whale. We don't use our arms to walk on, and we don't use them to fly, just like the bat doesn't use his arms for all the things that we can do, or for swimming, for example. Another example of homology that is often cited is an embryological homology of animals. So here's a chicken embryo and a human embryo, and they're pointing out just a couple of the homologous structures. Pharyngeal arches, these are derived from gill slits in fish. So a lot of times there's also a third picture here that would have a fish embryo, and the post-anal tail, right, which the chicken is going to keep and we are not. Now, these homologous structures, we can focus on gross anatomy. We would call these things gross anatomy, bone structure and tissue development. I would also remind you that in modern times, we can do molecular homology. We can look at DNA, RNA, and proteins and see homology between, like, for example, all of the proteins in the electron transport chain. Remember when we talked about cytochrome C as being one of the proteins of the cytochromes way back in chapter 9? The reason that we highlight that is because that is a homologous protein pretty much all the way from bacteria through every plant and animal that you can think of. These homologous structures are used then to produce what we would call phylogenetic diagrams or tree diagrams, and the branch points indicate the appearance of a new homologous characteristic that is shared by all of these organisms. Okay, and that causes particular branches. In chapter 26, or if you go on to Bio 2, you're going to learn a lot more about how these phylogenetic diagrams are constructed and more of the details, but this is just to kind of introduce that to you. Lastly, in your book in this particular section, they tell you to be careful not to confuse homologous organisms or homologous traits with analogous traits. Analogous traits are the result of convergent evolution, and they are when two different organisms share a characteristic, like flight, for example. And think about flight in insects compared with flight in birds. Those are analogous. They have structures that allow them to fly in a particular environment, but they are not evolutionarily related, so to speak, in terms of bone structure. That's what I can do off the top of my head. Fossil record, that would be number 3 of the major supports for evolution. This is just a real quick showing you some of the bone structure of the cetaceans, which of course are whales, belong to those group of mammals, even-toed ungulates, and most mammals. And I'm going to show you this branching diagram here that shows the common ancestor, and notice the homology of that bone development that has been determined by fossil evidence from modern organisms as well as fossils. And notice they've added a timeline here. Our first diagram didn't have a timeline. When it's possible to include fossil data and actual carbon dating and radiometric dating, then a lot of times a timeline shows up. And you can see the various organisms here. And some of these are fossil. The ones that I think are asterisked here, those are extinct organisms, and they're showing you some of the different hip bone development, pelvis and hip bone development, and how it's related to other ungulates and the hippopotamuses, more closely related to cetaceans than the other ungulates. And why don't I have, that's it, I don't have any more pictures. I would say stop share. I'm going to add to that another category, number 4. It's called biogeography. And again, I don't have a photograph for that. I should have pulled one from an earlier edition of the book, but I didn't. So I just wanted to talk to you about that real briefly. What biogeography means is it's defined as geographic distribution of species based on continental drift. Now, we're not going to talk specifically about continental drift, unfortunately, until chapter 25, but most of you, I think, have experienced some talk of continental drift throughout your grade school and high school life, in that all of the continents on the planet were originally in one large landmass that we call Pangaea, and then about 250 million years ago, Pangaea started to split apart and divide into the continents as we know it today. Oh, I could use that. Let me go back to this picture. Let's go back here, because this shows most of the continents, right? Related to biogeography, right? Particularly, we would call this the Wallace line. This is something that Alfred Russel Wallace described in his essays, and Darwin then asked his permission and used in his book, in his manuscript, as another supporting evidence for evolution, in that the islands are populated in one of 2 ways, and in the case of what Wallace discovered was that along through here, I think it's right between Borneo and Jakarta, that this island has genus, species, plants, and animals more closely related to those on Australia, whereas this island more closely related to what we would call Indochina, right? And Wallace said that's because even though the organisms have developed convergently or convergent evolutionarily, have developed similar characteristics in that they are inhabiting similar niches in the environment, these organisms were mostly marsupials, and these were mammals, if we were looking at the animals. And these birds were more closely related to the ones from Australia, and these more closely related to the ones here. Okay? So geographic distribution of species based on continental drift, based on where that particular island is located. All right, I think that ends what